What if I told you that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones plotting our destruction? This is the story of Duke Valerius Blackthorn, a man who spent 18 months hunting his beloved wife's killer, never suspecting that the murderer was sitting at his own dinner table every single night, sharing his wine and offering comfort while hiding the most sinister secret imaginable. It all started with a public execution that should have been routine. The witch was on the gallows, the rope was ready, and hundreds of bloodthirsty villagers had gathered to watch justice be served. But when Elara looked the Duke in the eye and whispered 7 words that would change everything, she revealed a truth so shocking it would tear apart everything he thought he knew about loyalty, love, and the supernatural forces that secretly shape our world. Today I'm going to tell you an incredible dark fantasy story about betrayal that cuts deeper than any blade, magic that demands the ultimate price, and a love so powerful it can literally transcend death itself. This isn't just medieval fiction, it's a psychological thriller that will make you question everyone you trust. But first, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I love seeing our global community grow. And if you're ready for a story that blends political intrigue with supernatural horror in ways that will leave you absolutely stunned, smash that like button and hit subscribe with notifications on. Because what that condemned witch said to the Duke on those gallows, it's going to blow your mind. Are you ready to discover the truth? The rope swayed like a pendulum, counting down the seconds until death, its coarse hemp fibers darkened by the blood of a dozen necks that had stretched beneath Ravensshallow's gallows. Duke Valerius Blackthorn stood motionless on the execution platform, his gauntlet hand resting on the pommel of his ancestral blade, the same sword that had carved his family's dominion from the bones of lesser men 3 centuries prior. Below him, the crowd pressed against the wooden barriers like starving wolves, their faces twisted with a particular hunger that came from witnessing sanctioned violence against those society had deemed expendable. The October wind cut through the courtyard with teeth sharp enough to draw blood from exposed skin, carrying the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of fierce sweat that always preceded public executions. Valerius breathed it in like wine, finding comfort in the familiar ritual that had become his only reliable source of satisfaction since Isabella's death 18 months ago. Each hanging was a small payment against the debt the world owed him, proof that justice still existed in a realm where poison could steal the one thing that made power bearable. The witch stood on the trapdoor with her wrists bound behind her back, though her posture suggested defiance rather than defeat. Elara Thornwick appeared younger than her supposed 40 years, her auburn hair catching what little sunlight penetrated the storm clouds gathering overhead. She wore the rough brown sackcloth of the condemned, but somehow managed to make even that wretched garment seem like armor fashioned from dignity and unbroken will. Her green eyes swept across the jeering crowd with the detached interest of someone studying insects, occasionally pausing to examine individual faces as if committing them to memory for future reference. "Any last words, witch?" Valerius called out, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard despite the crowd's bloodthirsty murmur. The question was mere formality. He had heard every variety of pleading, cursing, and desperate bargaining that condemned souls could produce. Most begged for mercy they had forfeited through their crimes. Others hurled impotent curses that died with their final breath. A few maintained dignified silence until the rope taught them humility. None had ever said anything that changed the inevitable outcome. The executioner, a hooded giant whose identity remained secret to protect him from the families of his victims, positioned his hand on the lever that would drop the trapdoor and send another enemy of order into whatever hell awaited practitioners of forbidden arts. The crowd's noise diminished to an expectant whisper as they sensed the approaching climax of their entertainment. Even the ravens that roost in the castle's highest towers seemed to lean forward in anticipation. Elara raised her head slowly, meeting Valerius's gaze with eyes that held depths he hadn't expected to find in someone facing imminent death. When she spoke, her voice carried across the courtyard with impossible clarity, cutting through the wind and the crowd's breathing like a blade through silk. "I know who poisoned Lady Isabella." The word struck Valerius like a crossbow bolt to the chest, stealing his breath and sending ice through his veins despite the warm blood that had been keeping him upright through 18 months of hunting his wife's killer. The crowd's murmur died completely, replaced by a silence so absolute that individual heartbeats became audible. Valerius felt his carefully constructed composure crack like glass under sudden pressure, revealing the raw wound that had been festering beneath his facade of cold justice. "What did you say?" he demanded, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtyard. His hand tightened on his sword hilt until the leather grip creaked under the pressure, while his other fist clenched with enough force to drive his signet ring's edges into his palm hard enough to draw blood. Elara's smile held no triumph, only the sad knowledge of someone who had seen too much of the world's hidden cruelties. "Your Grace knows exactly what I said. The question is whether you value vengeance more than truth, or if you're brave enough to discover that the enemy you've been hunting has been sitting at your own table, sharing your wine and counting your gold while you've been hanging innocent women like me." The executioner looked to Valerius for confirmation, his massive hand still poised over the lever that would end this conversation permanently. The crowd began to shift restlessly, sensing that their promised entertainment was being delayed by complications they couldn't understand. But Valerius found himself frozen between two equally terrible possibilities: that the witch was lying in a desperate attempt to save her own neck, or that she was telling the truth about the one thing that mattered more to him than his own life. "Speak plainly, witch," he commanded, though his voice carried undertones of uncertainty that would have been unthinkable before Isabella's death had taught him that even dukes could be brought low by forces beyond their control. "If you have knowledge of my wife's murder, you will share it immediately, or I will have you hanged, drawn, and quartered slowly enough that death becomes a mercy you beg for." Elara's expression softened slightly, as if she pitied him for the pain she was about to inflict. "Your Grace, Lady Isabella didn't die of fever, as the court physicians claimed. She was murdered with Mordian's kiss, a poison so rare that only 3 apothecaries in the 7 kingdoms know how to distill it. The killer needed access to your private chambers, knowledge of her daily routines, and enough wealth to purchase something that costs more than most nobles earn in a lifetime." The memory hit Valerius like a war hammer to the skull, dragging him back 18 months to the night that had divided his life into before and after with the brutal efficiency of an executioner's axe. Isabella had woken in the depths of night, her silk nightgown soaked with fever sweat that turned cold against his skin when he tried to comfort her. Her breathing had come in shallow gasps that reminded him of wounded animals he had seen dying on battlefields, and her beautiful brown eyes had darted around their bedchamber as if she could see enemies lurking in shadows that appeared empty to him. "The walls are bleeding," she had whispered, her voice distorted by delirium that the court physicians later attributed to brain fever brought on by the mysterious illness that had claimed her life before dawn. "Can you see it, Valerius? The blood is seeping through the stones, and it smells like copper and fear." Her fevered words had made no sense at the time, but now Valerius wondered if Mordian's kiss produced hallucinations that allowed its victims to perceive truths hidden from healthy minds. Dr. Aldwin had arrived within the hour, his weathered hands gentle as he examined Isabella's symptoms with the practiced efficiency of someone who had attended countless deathbeds. "Brain fever, Your Grace," he had diagnosed with the confidence that came from 40 years of medical practice. "The onset is sudden, but the progression follows predictable patterns. We'll bleed her to reduce the humors and apply cooling poultices to bring down the fever. With God's grace and proper treatment, she should recover within the week." But Isabella's condition had deteriorated with supernatural speed, as if the illness possessed malevolent intelligence that delighted in defying conventional medicine. Her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that reminded Valerius of expensive candles, while purple bruises bloomed across her arms and throat like grotesque flowers that had been watered with suffering. Most disturbing of all were her eyes, which had remained lucid even as her body failed around her, allowing her to watch helplessly as death approached with the patience of a creditor collecting an overdue debt. "The bitter taste," Valerius said suddenly, his voice cutting through the crowd's expectant murmur as another piece of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. "She complained about bitter wine at dinner, said the vintage had turned despite being from our best cask. I thought the servants had been careless with the storage." Elara nodded with the grim satisfaction of someone whose terrible knowledge had finally found a willing audience. "Mordian's kiss has a distinctive metallic aftertaste that lingers for hours after consumption. Experienced poisoners often mask it with strong wine or spiced meat, but the bitterness always breaks through eventually. Your wife would have tasted death in every sip, knowing something was wrong but unable to identify the source of her growing horror." The Duke felt his world tilting on its axis as 18 months of accepted truth revealed itself to be an elaborate lie constructed by someone with intimate knowledge of his household and his habits. The brain fever diagnosis had made sense at the time. Such illnesses struck quickly and killed without discrimination, claiming peasants and nobles with equal enthusiasm. But poison required planning, access, and motive that could only come from someone Isabella had trusted enough to share her private moments. The timing, he said, thinking aloud while his mind raced through possibilities he had never considered. She fell ill the night after the Harvest Council meeting, when all 5 of my advisors dined with us in the private hall. They all had access to the wine service, and they all knew her routines well enough to choose the perfect moment for an attack that would appear natural. Elara's expression grew more solemn as she watched him piece together the implications of her revelation. Your Grace, Mordian's kiss requires specific preparation methods that leave traces in the victim's body for months after death. If you exhume Lady Isabella's remains and have them examined by someone trained in toxicology rather than conventional medicine, you'll find crystalline deposits in her liver and bone marrow that prove she was murdered. The suggestion of disturbing his wife's grave sent a spike of revulsion through Valerius's chest, but beneath the horror was something else. Hope that justice might still be possible even after 18 months of misdirected grief. And you know this how, witch? What expertise do you possess that qualified physicians missed entirely? Because I've seen Mordian's kiss used before, Elara replied, her voice carrying the weight of terrible experience. My gift, my curse, allows me to perceive the manner of death by touching objects that belonged to the deceased. I saw Lady Isabella's final moments when I touched her prayer book during my arrest. The killer's face was hidden, but I felt their satisfaction as she struggled against poison they had administered hours earlier. Valerius glanced at the executioner, then at the crowd whose enthusiasm for bloodsport was beginning to turn into confused murmuring as they realized their entertainment was being delayed by complications they couldn't understand. Prove it, he demanded. Tell me something about my wife's death that only someone who witnessed it could know, something that wasn't in the official reports or court testimony. Elara closed her eyes for a moment, her face taking on the concentrated expression of someone accessing memories that belonged to another person. She tried to write a warning in her final minutes, using her own blood on the bedsheet beside her pillow. 3 letters before her strength failed, the beginning of a name that could have identified her killer. But someone cleaned the evidence before dawn, claiming they were preparing her body for the funeral vigil. The Duke's hand flew to his throat as if an invisible rope had suddenly tightened around his neck. No one except the chamber servants and the attending physician should have known about Isabella's desperate attempt at communication, and he had specifically ordered that detail excluded from all official records to preserve what remained of his wife's dignity. Yet this condemned which spoke of it with the casual accuracy of someone who had been present in the room during those terrible final hours. The killer sits at your council table right now, Elara continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every ear in the courtyard. They've spent 18 months watching you grieve, offering comfort and counsel while hiding satisfaction that their plan succeeded perfectly. But they made one mistake. They kept a sample of the poison as insurance against future threats, and that vial still exists somewhere in this castle. Duke Valerius felt the weight of every eye in the courtyard pressing against him like physical force, demanding a decision that would either condemn an innocent woman to death or acknowledge that his quest for justice had been built on a foundation of lies and misdirection. The crowd's bloodlust was palpable. They had come expecting entertainment and would not be easily disappointed by philosophical discussions about evidence and proof. Yet Elara's words carried a ring of truth that resonated in the hollow space where his heart had once beat with anything resembling happiness. Stand down, he commanded the executioner, whose hooded head turned toward him with what might have been surprise beneath the black cloth that concealed his features. Remove the witch from the platform and escort her to the castle's lower chambers. This execution is postponed pending further investigation into new evidence regarding the death of Lady Isabella. The crowd's reaction was immediate and volcanic. Shouts of protest and disappointment rose from hundreds of throats as their promised spectacle dissolved into legal proceedings that offered no satisfaction for those who had traveled considerable distances to witness sanctioned violence. Several voices called out questions about why a condemned witch's testimony should delay justice, while others demanded to know what new evidence could possibly matter when the woman's guilt had already been established through proper trials and testimony. But Valerius had already turned away from the gallows, his mind racing through implications that made his stomach clench with a mixture of rage and sick anticipation. If Elara spoke truth about the poison, then someone among his most trusted advisers had sat through 18 months of councils and dinners while hiding knowledge of Isabella's murder. They had watched him grieve, offered condolences and support, and helped him hunt for external enemies while the real killer remained safely hidden in plain sight. The castle's council chamber occupied the third floor of the eastern tower, its tall windows offering panoramic views of the surrounding countryside that had once allowed his ancestors to spot approaching armies from leagues away. Now those same windows served mainly to illuminate the ancient oak table where 5 men had gathered in response to his urgent summons, their faces showing varying degrees of confusion and concern at being called away from their normal duties with such obvious haste. Lord Chancellor Aldwin sat at the table's head, his weathered hands folded over documents that bore the official seals of their ongoing correspondence with neighboring duchies. Sir Marcus, the captain of guards, occupied the chair to his right, his scarred face bearing the stoic expression that had served him through 30 years of military campaigns. Beside him sat Master Corwin, the castle's steward, whose meticulous records had kept their household functioning smoothly through the chaos that followed Isabella's death. The remaining seats held Master Edwin, the court physician whose failed attempts to save Isabella had earned him 18 months of barely concealed hostility from a duke who blamed everyone for his wife's death, and Lord Garrett, Valerius's younger cousin whose inheritance of the family's eastern holdings had made him wealthy enough to maintain his own household but ambitious enough to covet greater power. "Gentlemen," Valerius said, settling into his chair with movements that carried none of his usual confident authority, "I have received disturbing information regarding the circumstances of Lady Isabella's death. Information that suggests her illness may not have been natural in origin." The silence that followed his announcement was absolute, broken only by the sound of autumn wind rattling the windows in their frames. He watched each man's face carefully, looking for signs of guilt or recognition that might identify the killer who had been hiding among them. But their expressions showed only the appropriate surprise and concern that loyal retainers should display when learning their lady's death might have been murder. "Your Grace," Lord Chancellor Aldwin said finally, his voice carrying the careful neutrality that had made him valuable in diplomatic negotiations, "might I ask what source provided this information?" The circumstances of Lady Isabella's passing were thoroughly investigated at the time, and Master Edwin's diagnosis was confirmed by 3 independent physicians brought in from the capital. Valerius met the physician's eyes, noting how Master Edwin's face had gone pale at the mention of outside confirmation for his original diagnosis. "The source claims Lady Isabella was poisoned with something called Mordian's kiss, a substance apparently so rare that few practitioners would recognize its effects. Master Edwin, does this name hold any meaning for you?" The physician's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water goblet that sat before his chair, though his voice remained steady when he spoke. "Mordian's kiss is indeed a real poison, Your Grace, though I have never encountered it personally. The texts describe it as a crystalline compound derived from certain mushrooms that grow only in the Shadowlands. The symptoms would indeed mimic brain fever in their early stages, though the progression would be more rapid than natural illness typically allows." Sir Marcus leaned forward, his soldier's instincts clearly engaged by the possibility that Lady Isabella's death had been an enemy action requiring military response. "If this proves true, Your Grace, we'll need to identify who had access to such exotic materials. The Shadowlands are 3 months' journey by sea, and Mordian's kiss would command prices that few could afford without drawing attention to their purchases." Master Corwin nodded agreement, his ledger-keeper's mind already cataloguing the financial implications. "I could review our trade records for any unusual expenditures or shipments from the southern ports. If someone acquired such a poison, they would have needed significant resources and careful planning to avoid detection." But it was Lord Garrett who asked the question that hung over the room like an executioner's blade. "Your Grace, what makes you believe this information is reliable? Condemned prisoners have been known to fabricate elaborate tales in hopes of delaying their executions." Valerius studied his cousin's face, noting how Garrett's blue eyes seemed to avoid direct contact while his hands remained perfectly steady despite the gravity of the accusations being discussed. The source provided details about Isabella's final hours that were not included in any official reports. Details that only someone present during her death could have known. The revelation that their new information came from someone with intimate knowledge of the crime scene sent another wave of tension through the assembled men. Valerius watched each face carefully, looking for the telltale signs of guilt that would identify which of these trusted advisors had betrayed not only his wife but the foundational trust that made civilized society possible. "Gentlemen," he continued, his voice taking on the hard edge that had once made enemy soldiers reconsider their loyalty to opposing causes, "until this matter is resolved, none of you will leave the castle grounds. Consider yourselves under protective custody while we investigate whether Lady Isabella's killer sits among us at this very table." The journey to the Shadowlands required traveling through territories where the rule of law grew thin as morning mist, replaced by older codes that valued strength over justice and cunning over honor. Duke Valerius had chosen to make the trip with minimal escort, only Elara and 2 trusted guards who had sworn blood oaths that predated his marriage and therefore couldn't be compromised by recent betrayals. They rode disguised as wealthy merchants, their fine clothes exchanged for the practical leather and wool that would draw less attention from the bandits and cutthroats who preyed on obvious nobility. Elara proved to be a surprisingly capable traveling companion, sitting her horse with the natural grace of someone who had learned to ride before she could properly walk. Her auburn hair was now hidden beneath a practical traveling hood, and she had traded the condemned prisoner's sackcloth for the dark green woolen dress of a merchant's wife. But her eyes remained alert to dangers that extended beyond mortal threats, occasionally pausing to study shadows that held nothing visible while her fingers traced protective symbols on her horse's mane. "You're beginning to understand," she said as they made camp on their 3rd night, her voice carrying clearly across the space between their bedrolls despite being pitched barely above a whisper. "The world is far stranger and more dangerous than your ducal education prepared you to comprehend. Magic isn't just superstition embraced by ignorant peasants, it's a force that shapes reality in ways that conventional wisdom refuses to acknowledge." Valerius poked at their campfire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the star-scattered darkness above their heads. "I understand that someone I trusted killed my wife using methods that shouldn't exist according to everything I was taught about the natural order. Whether that constitutes magic or simply exotic science is a philosophical distinction that matters less than identifying the guilty party." Their conversation was interrupted by sounds that had no business existing in the mortal world. Howls that carried harmonics suggesting throats larger than any wolf that walked on 4 legs, accompanied by the scratch of claws against stone that indicated creatures with feet designed for climbing rather than running. Elara was on her feet instantly, her hands weaving patterns in the air that left trails of silver light hanging like frozen lightning. "Shadow wolves," she said, her voice tight with concentration as she maintained whatever protection she was crafting. "They hunt in packs and feed on fear as much as flesh. Your guards' weapons won't harm them, but they'll retreat if faced with sufficient magical force." Valerius drew his sword despite her warning, the ancestral blade singing as it cleared its sheath with a distinctive sound that had announced his family's presence on battlefields for 3 centuries. "I don't retreat from wolves, magical or otherwise. If they want to test themselves against blackthorn steel, they're welcome to learn why my ancestors carved this duchy from lands held by creatures that thought themselves our betters." The first shadow wolf emerged from the darkness like liquid night given predatory form, its eyes burning with intelligence that seemed almost human in its calculated malice. It was larger than any natural wolf, with fur that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and teeth that gleamed with their own phosphorescent glow. When it spoke, its voice carried the cultured accent of educated nobility despite emerging from a muzzle designed for rending flesh from bone. "Duke Valerius Blackthorn," it said, circling their campfire with movements that suggested it was evaluating their defensive capabilities rather than simply preparing to attack. "You travel far from your comfortable castle to consort with witches and delve into mysteries that were buried for good reason. Perhaps you should consider whether some knowledge is too dangerous for mortal minds to safely possess. Perhaps you should consider whether some mortals are too dangerous to threaten with cryptic warnings," Valerius replied, adjusting his grip on his sword while keeping his eyes fixed on the creature's burning gaze. "I've killed men, beasts, and things that fell somewhere between the 2 categories. Adding shadow wolves to that list would be a novel experience, but not necessarily an unwelcome one. The confrontation might have escalated to violence that would have tested Elara's protective magic against supernatural predators, but she chose that moment to unleash power that had been building in her hands since the creatures first announced their presence. Silver fire erupted from her fingertips like liquid starlight, washing over the shadow wolves with radiance that made them howl in harmonies that suggested multiple throats crying out in pain and rage. When the light faded, the wolves had vanished back into whatever realm had spawned them, leaving only the scent of ozone and burned amber to prove they had ever existed. But Elara collapsed to her knees, blood streaming from her nose while her hands shook with exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. More disturbing still were the black marks that had appeared on Valerius's throat, spiral scars that resembled brands left by heated iron, though he felt no pain from their sudden manifestation. "What have you done to me?" he demanded, touching the marks that felt warm beneath his fingertips despite their dark appearance. "What kind of magic leaves its mark on those it's meant to protect?" Elara wiped blood from her nose with the back of her hand, her green eyes now holding depths that hadn't been there before their encounter with the shadow wolves. "Magic always demands payment, Your Grace. I borrowed power from the only source available, your own life force. The marks show that you've been touched by forces beyond mortal understanding. They'll fade in time, but while they remain, you'll be able to perceive things that were previously hidden from your sight." As if her words had awakened dormant senses, Valerius began to notice details that his eyes should not have been able to resolve in the darkness surrounding their camp. He could see the individual threads of magic that Elara had woven to create their protection, hanging in the air like spider silk made from captured moonlight. More disturbing still, he could perceive something vast and malevolent moving in the distance, a presence so immense that his mind struggled to process its true scale. "The corruption spreads faster than we anticipated," Elara said, following his gaze toward the horizon where darkness seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. "Your wife's killer didn't choose Mordian's kiss randomly. It's a key component in summoning rituals that require blood sacrifice from someone of noble lineage. Lady Isabella's death was just the beginning of something far more terrible than simple murder for personal gain." The mining complex sprawled across the valley floor like a festering wound in the earth's flesh, its wooden structures stained black by the toxic fumes that rose from shafts burrowed deep into veins of rare or that commanded prices high enough to justify the human cost of extraction. Hundreds of workers moved between the buildings with the mechanical precision of people who had learned that survival depended on efficiency, their faces bearing the characteristic pallor that came from breathing air laden with metallic dust and supernatural corruption. Duke Valerius felt his enhanced vision catalog details that his normal sight would have missed. The way shadows moved independently of the objects that should have cast them, the sickly green glow that emanated from the deeper mine shafts, and most disturbing of all, the spectral figures that wandered among the living workers like transparent echoes of those who had died in the tunnels below. The marks on his throat pulsed with heat that intensified as they approached the source of whatever dark power had taken root in this place. "Mordian's kiss isn't just a poison," Elara explained as they surveyed the mining operation from a ridge that offered concealment while allowing them to observe the workers' routines. "It's distilled from fungi that grow only in places where the barrier between worlds has been weakened by prolonged exposure to certain rare minerals. The mushrooms feed on death and despair, concentrating those energies into crystalline form that can be weaponized by those with sufficient knowledge and complete absence of conscience." Master Blackwood, the mine's overseer, greeted them with the nervous enthusiasm of someone accustomed to dealing with wealthy merchants who possessed the capital necessary to purchase exotic materials at premium prices. He was a thin man whose expensive clothes couldn't quite disguise the tremor in his hands, or the haunted expression that suggested he had seen too much of whatever transpired in the deeper tunnels during night shifts when supervision grew lax and unusual sounds echoed from places where no sounds should exist. "Welcome to Shadowheart Mine," he said, his voice carrying forced cheer that fooled no one present. "I trust your journey wasn't too arduous? The roads have been somewhat dangerous lately. Bandits and worse things seem drawn to these parts by the valuable materials we extract from the earth's hidden veins." Valerius adopted the brusque manner of a merchant whose time was valuable and whose patience for pleasantries was limited. "We're here about a specific purchase made 18 months ago. A substantial quantity of processed Mordian's kiss delivered to someone claiming to represent noble interests in the northern duchies." Our records show the transaction, but the buyer's identity was obscured through intermediaries. Blackwood's face went pale at the mention of Mordian's kiss, his eyes darting toward the mine entrances as if he expected something terrible to emerge in response to hearing the forbidden name spoken aloud. That was an unusual order, sir. Most buyers only want small quantities for scholarly research or exotic medicine. But your client requested enough processed material to kill a small army, and they paid in gold coins that bore ducal seals from multiple kingdoms. Elara leaned forward with interest that carried undertones of magical perception, actively engaged. These coins, did you examine them closely? Sometimes payment methods can reveal more about a buyer's identity than the false names they provide during negotiations. Oh yes, ma'am, we always verify payment carefully. Can't afford to accept counterfeit currency in our line of work. But these coins were genuine, marked with the seals of House Blackthorn, House Ravencrest, and House Ironwood. The buyer claimed to represent a consortium of noble houses conducting joint research into exotic toxins for defensive purposes. The revelation that his own family's gold had been used to purchase the poison that killed Isabella sent rage through Valerius's chest like molten metal, but beneath the fury was cold calculation that recognized the implications of such elaborate planning. Someone with access to multiple ducal treasuries had orchestrated his wife's murder, which meant the conspiracy extended far beyond his own household and probably involved coordination between noble houses that publicly maintained friendly relations. The worker deaths, Elara said suddenly, her enhanced senses apparently detecting something that had escaped normal observation. You've lost people to the same symptoms Lady Isabella experienced: the waxy pallor, the purple bruising, the rapid deterioration that defied conventional treatment. How many have died, and when did the deaths begin? Blackwood's composure cracked completely at her question, revealing the terrified man who had been hiding beneath the facade of confident business management. Dozens, ma'am. Maybe more. It started about 2 years ago, when we opened the deepest shaft and found the chamber where the fungi grow in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The workers who spend time in that area start seeing things: dead relatives, burning children, armies of skeletons marching through the tunnels. Then comes the fever, and then... He gestured helplessly toward a section of the mining complex that Valerius now realized was a graveyard, where wooden crosses marked the resting places of those who had died from exposure to whatever supernatural corruption festered in the mine's depths. But his enhanced vision revealed something far more disturbing: spectral figures rising from those graves, their translucent forms bearing expressions of rage and betrayal that suggested death had not brought them the peace they deserved. "Your Grace," Elara said urgently, her voice tight with alarm as she perceived threats that were beginning to materialize around them. "We need to leave immediately. Someone has been using this place to harvest ingredients for a summoning ritual that requires specific timing and astronomical alignment. The next phase begins at dawn tomorrow, and it will involve the sacrifice of 50 children from the local villages." The scope of the atrocity being planned struck Valerius like a physical blow, making him understand that Isabella's murder had been merely the opening move in a campaign of supernatural terrorism designed to destabilize the entire region. Who could orchestrate something of this magnitude? What kind of power would such a ritual grant to whoever performed it successfully? Elara's expression grew grim as she consulted knowledge that came from sources no mortal should have accessed. The kind of power that could reshape the balance between the mortal world and the realms that press against it from beyond the barriers of normal reality. And based on the magical signatures I'm detecting, the person responsible is someone you know intimately, someone whose magical education was far more extensive than they ever revealed to you. Before Valerius could demand clarification, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of riders who had been tracking them since they left the main road. Lord Garrett emerged from the tree line with a company of armed men, their weapons drawn and their faces bearing expressions that left no doubt about their hostile intentions. But it was the way shadows bent around Garrett's form and the unnatural glow in his eyes that confirmed Elara's suspicions about the true identity of Isabella's killer. "Hello, cousin," Garrett said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple throats speaking in unison. "I was hoping you'd lead me to the source of the ingredients I need for tomorrow's ceremony." Killing you here will save me the trouble of hunting you down after I ascend to the power that should have been mine by right of superior knowledge and ambition. The abandoned temple where Garrett had established his ritual site occupied a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside by forces that predated human civilization, its stone walls bearing symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Duke Valerius felt his enhanced vision struggle to process architecture that followed geometries impossible in the mortal world, while the marks on his throat burned with intensity that suggested proximity to magical forces powerful enough to reshape reality according to their wielder's will. 50 children from the surrounding villages lay bound and unconscious in a circle around a central altar carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it. Their ages ranged from perhaps 8 to 16, and their pale faces bore expressions of unnatural peace that suggested they had been drugged with substances designed to keep them compliant during the hours of preparation that such elaborate rituals required. "You always were too sentimental, Valerius," Garrett said as his men forced the Duke and Elara down stone steps that had been worn smooth by centuries of feet belonging to worshippers whose gods demanded blood sacrifice from their mortal servants. "Isabella's death should have taught you that attachment to others is a weakness that your enemies will exploit without hesitation or mercy. Instead, you've spent 18 months hunting shadows while the real threat gathered power under your very nose." The transformation that had overcome Garrett was more complete than Valerius had realized during their brief confrontation at the mining complex. His cousin's features retained their basic human configuration, but his skin had taken on a waxy pallor that reminded him of expensive candles, while his eyes now burned with phosphorescent light that hurt to look at directly. Most disturbing of all were the black veins that pulsed beneath his skin like parasitic worms feeding on whatever humanity he had once possessed. "The inheritance laws never made sense," Garrett continued, beginning to trace complex symbols in the air above the altar while his voice took on the rhythmic cadence of someone reciting formulas learned through years of dedicated study. "Why should accident of birth order determine who inherits power when superior knowledge and ambition clearly mark those destined for greatness? Isabella understood that principle. She was actually quite supportive of my research until she discovered what the final ritual would require." Elara struggled against the ropes that bound her wrists, her green eyes wide with horror as she perceived the true scope of the magical working that Garrett had spent years preparing. "You're trying to break the barriers between worlds permanently," she whispered, her voice carrying the odd terror of someone who understood exactly what such an action would unleash upon the mortal realm. "The children aren't just sacrifices, they're anchors that will hold the gate open indefinitely." "Very good, witch," Garrett replied with the condescending approval that professors offered to students who had finally grasped concepts that should have been obvious from the beginning. "The traditional summoning rituals only create temporary openings that close as soon as the caster's concentration wavers. But innocent blood spilled according to precise astronomical calculations can create permanent tears in reality that allow beings of immense power to establish permanent presence in our world." Valerius tested the strength of his own bonds while his mind raced through possibilities for escape that seemed increasingly unlikely as more of Garrett's corrupted followers took positions around the temple's perimeter. "And what do you imagine these beings will offer you in exchange for destroying everything our ancestors built to protect humanity from forces that view us as either prey or playthings?" His cousin's laughter carried harmonics that suggested multiple throats speaking in unison, while the symbols he traced above the altar began to glow with their own malevolent light that cast dancing shadows on the temple walls. "Power, dear cousin. Pure, undiluted power that transcends the petty limitations of mortal flesh and medieval politics. When the barriers fall and the old ones reclaim dominion over this realm, I will serve as their voice in the mortal world, a position that carries privileges you cannot begin to imagine." The ritual was clearly reaching its climax as the first pale fingers of dawn light began to penetrate the temple's shadowed interior, causing the bound children to stir with movements that suggested their drugged sleep was beginning to wear off. Garrett raised a ceremonial dagger whose blade appeared to be forged from the same black stone as the altar, its edge gleaming with oils that gave off vapors capable of inducing hallucinations in anyone who breathed them. "Isabella's death was necessary to consecrate the blade with noble blood," Garrett explained as he positioned himself above the first child, a girl perhaps 10 years old whose golden hair reminded Valerius painfully of his dead wife's younger sister. "But her sacrifice will seem trivial compared to what these innocents will provide. Each death will weaken the barriers a little more. until reality itself becomes malleable enough for the old ones to reshape according to their ancient will. Elara closed her eyes and began to speak in a language that predated human civilization, her voice growing stronger despite the ropes that bound her and the obvious exhaustion from their journey through hostile territory. Silver light began to emanate from her skin like moonlight filtering through fog, while the temperature in the temple dropped several degrees as her magic drew power from sources that existed beyond the normal flow of time and space. "You cannot stop what has already begun, witch," Garrett snarled, raising the ceremonial dagger higher while his followers chanted in harmonies that made the air itself vibrate with supernatural energy. "The alignment is perfect, the sacrifices are prepared, and the old ones are already pressing against barriers that have grown thin as parchment. Your pathetic magic might delay the inevitable by minutes, but it cannot prevent the dawn of a new age." But Elara's spell was not designed to stop the ritual. It was intended to transfer every ounce of her remaining life force into the bonds that held Valerius, imbuing them with enough magical energy to shatter like glass under the enhanced strength that now flowed through his veins. He broke free just as Garrett brought the dagger down toward the first child's throat, his ancestral sword appearing in his hand with the fluid motion that had been drilled into him through decades of combat training. The blade met the ceremonial dagger with a sound like thunder, sending shockwaves through the temple that cracked the ancient stones and sent several of Garrett's followers stumbling backward. But the impact also drove the black blade's point deep into Elara's chest as she threw herself between the descending weapon and the bound child, her blood spattering across the altar in patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. "No!" Valerius roared, his enhanced vision allowing him to see the threads of magic that connected Elara's life force to the protective spells she had woven around the children. As her blood struck the altar, those protections began to unravel like a tapestry being pulled apart by invisible hands, while something vast and terrible pressed against the weakening barriers between worlds. Elara collapsed to her knees, her hands pressed against the wound in her chest while blood seeped between her fingers to join the stains that already marked the ancient stones. But her green eyes remained focused on Valerius with intensity that suggested she was trying to communicate something crucial despite the pain that made speech nearly impossible. "The blood," she gasped, her voice barely audible above the sound of reality beginning to tear along seams that had held for millennia. "It has to be willing sacrifice. Mine changes everything, breaks his control." As her life force ebbed away, the silver light that had emanated from her skin began to concentrate in the pool of blood spreading beneath her body. The ancient altar, which had been designed to channel sacrificial energy toward opening gates between worlds, suddenly reversed its function as Elara's willing self-sacrifice transformed it into a focal point for protective magic that drew power from sources the original architects had never intended. But her sacrifice had awakened something else. Something that had been sleeping in the spaces between Valerius's heartbeats ever since the marks appeared on his throat. He could feel it stirring to life like a dragon uncoiling from centuries of slumber, bringing with it knowledge and power that had been passed down through bloodlines that stretched back to the first humans who had learned to wield forces beyond mortal understanding. The entity that began to manifest above Elara's dying form was not one of the old ones that Garrett had sought to summon, but something else entirely. Something that had been bound to the Blackthorn bloodline through oaths sworn in ages when the world was younger and the boundaries between life and death were more fluid than they had since become. The entity that materialized from Elara's spilled blood wore Isabella's face, but her eyes held depths that belonged to someone who had journeyed through realms beyond mortal comprehension and returned bearing knowledge that transcended the simple categories of life and death. She stood above her own dying body like a ghost made solid through forces that operated according to principles older than the gods that men claimed to worship, her presence causing the temple's ancient stones to resonate with harmonics that made reality itself ring like a struck bell. "Hello, my love," Isabella said, her voice carrying the same warmth that had sustained Valerius through years of marriage, though it now bore undertones of power that made the air shimmer around her translucent form. "I'm sorry it took so long to find a way back to you. The path between the living and the dead is more complex than the poets suggest, and it required very specific circumstances to make the journey possible." Valerius felt his enhanced vision catalog details that his mind struggled to process. The way Isabella's ghostly form occupied the same space as Elara's dying body, the threads of silver light that connected them like a bridge spanning two different states of existence, and most unsettling of all, the expression of recognition that passed between his dead wife and his treacherous cousin. This was not a random haunting brought about by proximity to powerful magic, but a deliberate manifestation that had been planned and orchestrated through means he couldn't begin to understand. Impossible, Garrett snarled, his own magical protections flaring to life as he recognized the threat that Isabella's presence represented to his carefully planned ritual. The dead cannot return without specific summoning rites and binding contracts with entities that demand payment in blood and souls. You have no power here, spirit. Your time in the mortal world ended when my poison stopped your heart 18 months ago. Isabella's laughter carried the musical quality that had first attracted Valerius's attention during a long-ago court festival, but now it also held harmonics that suggested knowledge of cosmic jokes too vast for mortal minds to appreciate. Oh, sweet Garrett. You always were so proud of your scholarly research and your carefully memorized formulas. But you never understood the most fundamental principle of magic, that love is a force more powerful than any technique described in forbidden texts. She gestured toward Elara's dying form with movements that left trails of silver light hanging in the air like frozen lightning. This brave woman didn't just sacrifice her life to save those children. She offered her very soul as a vessel for my return, creating a bridge between worlds that operates according to laws your corrupted mind cannot comprehend. The willing sacrifice of one pure heart can accomplish miracles that all the blood magic in existence cannot duplicate. The revelation that Isabella had somehow been present during their entire journey, hidden within Elara's consciousness like a passenger in someone else's body, recontextualized every conversation and every moment of growing trust between the Duke and the condemned witch. Valerius understood now why Elara had possessed such intimate knowledge of Isabella's final hours, why she had been able to guide him toward the truth with such precision, and why her green eyes had sometimes seemed to hold depths that belonged to someone else entirely. You used me, he said, though his voice carried wonder rather than accusation as he began to grasp the scope of what his wife had orchestrated from beyond the grave. All of this, the execution, the journey, the investigation, you planned it all to bring us to this moment when Garrett's ritual would provide the power necessary for your manifestation. Isabella nodded, her expression showing the same mixture of love and regret that had marked their final conversation before poison claimed her life. I couldn't rest while my killer walked free and plotted atrocities that would have destroyed everything we fought to protect. But the laws governing the dead are strict. I could only act through someone who chose to serve as my willing vessel, and only during moments when the barriers between worlds grew thin enough to permit supernatural intervention. Garrett raised his ceremonial dagger again, its black blade now crackling with energies drawn from the partially completed ritual that had already weakened reality's foundation enough to make his cousin's return possible. Touching as this reunion may be, it changes nothing about the fundamental situation. The barriers are broken, the old ones are stirring, and I have more than enough power to banish one ghost and finish what I started. But Isabella had not returned alone. The silver light that emanated from her spectral form began to coalesce into shapes that Valerius recognized as the previous dukes of Raven's Hollow, his ancestors who had sworn oaths to protect the realm from supernatural threats and whose spirits had been waiting centuries for the opportunity to fulfill those ancient obligations. They materialized around the temple like an army of the righteous dead, their translucent forms bearing the weapons and armor they had carried in life. The Blackthorn bloodline has served as guardians of the mortal realm for 15 generations, Isabella explained as the ghostly army took positions around Garrett's corrupted followers, who suddenly found themselves outnumbered by opponents their physical weapons could not harm. Each duke swore sacred oaths that bound their souls to defend humanity against forces that sought to breach the barriers between worlds. Your enhanced vision and newfound abilities aren't random side effects of magical exposure. They're the activation of gifts that have been dormant in your bloodline for generations. Valerius felt power flowing through his veins like liquid fire, bringing with it knowledge that had been passed down through bloodlines that stretched back to the first humans who had learned to wield forces beyond mortal understanding. His ancestral sword began to glow with the same silver light that emanated from Isabella's form, its blade singing with harmonics that made the air itself vibrate with protective magic. The final battle was brief but decisive. Garrett's corrupted followers found themselves facing opponents who existed partially outside the normal flow of time and space, making conventional tactics useless against enemies who could strike from directions that didn't exist in three-dimensional reality. The ceremonial dagger that had claimed Isabella's life shattered like glass when it met Valerius's enhanced blade, its destruction sending shockwaves through the partially opened gates that slammed them closed with finality that would last until the next astronomical alignment centuries in the future. As dawn light filled the temple with natural radiance that drove away the shadows where supernatural corruption had taken root, Isabella's ghostly form began to fade like mist before the rising sun. But her final words carried clearly across the space between life and death, bridging the gap that had separated them for 18 months of grief and misdirected vengeance.